I'm 82 years old, and there are words I still haven't said out loud. Not because I didn't feel them. I felt them all my life. I just kept waiting for the right moment, and the right moment never came. At my age, you don't have many people left who remember the younger version of you, the one with dark hair, the one who could run up a flight of stairs without thinking about it, the one who still believed time was something you had plenty of. Most of the people who knew me then are gone now. And the strange thing is, the older you get, the more your life starts to feel like a series of unfinished sentences. Things you meant to say, things you almost said, things you practiced in your head and never spoke. I'm sitting in a quiet house as I record this. The refrigerator hums. The floorboards creak when the heat kicks on. That's about all the company I have most days. Sometimes I look at the phone and wonder who I could call. And then I remember the list is shorter than it used to be. So I'm telling this now not because it will fix anything. It won't. I'm telling it because I waited too long and I don't want someone else to do the same. When I was young, I thought silence was maturity. I thought holding things and made me strong. I thought being the calm one, the dependable one, the one who didn't need much, I thought that was a good way to live. People praised me for it. They said I was steady. They said I was practical. They said I was a good man, and maybe I was. But I was also afraid. I didn't call it fear at the time. I called it being careful. I called it not wanting to make a scene. I called it not wanting to burden anyone. But it was fear. Fear of being rejected. Fear of being laughed at. Fear of being too much. Fear of saying something honest and not being met with the same honesty. And that fear, it cost me more than any mistake I ever made with money. I grew up in a house where people didn't talk about feelings. We talked about weather, work, bills, food. We talked about what needed to be done. My father was a good man in his own way, but he was made of stone. If he was proud of you, you knew because he didn't criticize you that day. My mother worked herself into the ground. She didn't complain, she just kept going. If she was sad, she hid it in the sink full of dishes. I learned early that feelings were private things, dangerous things. If you cried, you were told to stop. If you got angry, you were told to calm down. If you got excited, you were told not to get ahead of yourself. So I learned to swallow everything. I got good at it, and it followed me into adulthood like a shadow. I met my wife when I was 24. Her name was Alina. I still say her name sometimes when no one is around, not because I think she can hear me, but because it keeps her real. She worked at a little bookstore downtown. I went in looking for a repair manual for my car, and she told me they didn't carry those kinds of books. Then she smiled like she was amused that I thought they might. She had this way of looking at you like she could see the part of you didn't show anyone else. I was nervous around her, not the usual kind of nervous, not sweaty palms and stammering. It was deeper than that, like she made me aware of myself, like she could tell I was hiding. I asked her out and she said yes, just like that. Like it wasn't a big decision, like she wasn't afraid. That was one of the first things I loved about her. She wasn't afraid of her own feelings. If she was happy, you knew it. If she was disappointed, you knew it. If she loved you, you knew it. And she did love me. I never doubted that, but I made her doubt whether I loved her back. Not because I didn't. I did. I loved her so much it scared me. But I didn't say it the way I should have. I didn't say it enough. I didn't say it when it mattered. I said it in small ways. I fixed things around the house. I worked overtime. I paid the bills on time. I made sure her car always had gas. I thought those things were love. And they were in a way, but they weren't the kind of love she needed to hear. Sometimes she would stand in the kitchen holding a dish towel and she would look at me and say, "You never talk about what you feel." And I'd shrug. I'd say, "I'm here, all right." Or I'd say, "I don't know what you want me to say." Or I'd joke because jokes were safer than truth. And she would sigh the way a person sighs when they realize they're speaking to a wall. We were married for 52 years. That sounds like a long time, and it is. But I'm telling you, you can spend 50 years with someone and still leave things unsaid. People think time fixes that. It doesn't. Time makes you more comfortable avoiding it. We had 2 children, a boy and a girl, David and Susan. I remember holding David the first time. I was terrified. He was so small. His face was red and scrunched up like he was angry about being born. Alina looked exhausted, but she was smiling. She said, "Look at him, he's perfect." And I looked down at him and felt something open up inside me, something warm and frightening, like my heart was suddenly exposed. I wanted to tell her how grateful I was, how amazed I was by her, how proud I was, how I couldn't believe she was my wife, but the words got stuck. So I kissed her forehead and said, "You did good." That's what I said, "You did good," as if she'd just finished painting a fence. She laughed a little, but her eyes didn't, and I didn't notice. Or maybe I did and chose not to. That's the truth of it. A lot of the time I noticed. I just didn't know what to do with it. I worked hard. I became a supervisor at the plant. I was proud of that. I wanted to provide. I wanted my children to have what I didn't have. And that was the excuse I used for everything. Why I missed dinner. Why I missed school plays. Why I was too tired to talk at night. Why I didn't take Alina dancing when she asked. "Work's been rough," I'd say, or maybe next weekend. Or "We'll do it when things slow down." Things never slowed down. I thought life would eventually reach a point where you could finally breathe. Like you could just get through the hard part and then the good part would begin. But life doesn't work like that. Life is the hard part and the good part at the same time. And if you keep postponing the good part, one day you look around and realize you skipped most of it. There's a memory I keep coming back to. It's small, but it haunts me. I was in my late 30s. Alina had made dinner, meatloaf, I think. She always made meatloaf when she wanted the house to feel warm. The kids were still little. Susan was talking about something from school, waving her fork around, spilling peas on the table. Alina was laughing. She had flour on her cheek, I don't even remember why. And for a moment, everything was good, simple, whole. Then the phone rang. It was my boss. Someone didn't show up for the night shift. He asked if I could come in. I remember Alina's face. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked down at her plate and started cutting her food again like she was trying to make herself smaller. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I got up, grabbed my jacket, and David asked, "Are you leaving?" And I said, "Just for a little while." Alina didn't argue. She never liked to argue. She just said, "Drive safe." And that was it. I didn't see the way her shoulders slumped when I walked out. Or maybe I did, and I told myself it was fine, because I told myself there would be other dinners, there would be other laughs, there would be other chances. And there were. But they were fewer each year, and I didn't notice until it was too late. I was always waiting to feel settled before I became fully present. I waited to tell Alina how beautiful she was until she was already older and didn't believe it anymore. I waited to tell my children how proud I was until they were already grown and didn't need it the same way. I waited to apologize for my coldness until the distance had already hardened into something permanent. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. That's the part that still makes me sick to my stomach. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't abusive. I wasn't out drinking or running around. I was just absent in the places that mattered, emotionally absent, and people can live with a lot, but they can't live with that forever. Alina tried for years to pull me closer. She would ask me questions at night. "What are you thinking about? Are you happy? Do you ever miss who we used to be?" And I would answer with the shortest thing possible. "I'm fine. Just tired. Don't worry so much." Sometimes she'd roll over in bed and face the wall, and I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, feeling something heavy in my chest. I would want to reach for her, but I wouldn't. Because what if she didn't reach back? What if she was angry? What if she cried? I didn't know how to handle tears. I didn't know how to handle real conversations, so I stayed still. And I let the silence do the work for me. Silence is easy when you're young. You think it's harmless. But silence has a way of becoming your personality. It becomes the air in the house. It becomes the distance between two people sitting at the same table. And then one day, you realize you've been living next to someone instead of with them. Alina got sick when she was 71. It started with little things. She would forget where she put her keys. She would repeat herself. She would lose her train of thought mid-sentence and laugh it off. At first, we joked about it. "Old age," she said. But then she started forgetting names. Then she forgot the route to the grocery store she'd been driving to for 20 years. I remember the day the doctor said the word Alzheimer's. The room got very quiet. Alina nodded like she understood, but I don't think she did. Not fully. Not yet. I did. Because suddenly time didn't feel endless anymore. Suddenly all those conversations I had avoided, they weren't waiting for me anymore. They were slipping away. I wanted to tell her everything then. I wanted to sit down and say, "I'm sorry I wasn't the husband you needed. I'm sorry I made you feel alone. I'm sorry I didn't say the words." But I still didn't. I held her hand. I said, "We'll get through this." And she looked at me and said, "I'm scared." I should have said, "I'm scared too." I should have said, "I love you more than I ever knew how to say." I should have said, "You were the best thing that ever happened to me." Instead, I said, "It'll be all right." It wasn't all right. Nothing about it was all right. And then the years started disappearing. At first, she was still mostly herself. She would bake cookies and forget them in the oven. She would put the milk in the pantry and the cereal in the fridge. She would laugh at herself, but her laughter had fear in it. Then she stopped laughing. Then she started getting angry, not at me exactly, just at the confusion, at the world not making sense. Sometimes she would look at me like she didn't trust me. That was the hardest part. The woman who once looked at me like she could see my soul started looking at me like I was a stranger. And in a way, I was, because she had spent decades trying to know me and I never fully let her. One night she asked me, "Are you my brother?" I felt something break inside me. I told her, "No, Ellie, I'm your husband." And she frowned like she didn't believe me. I sat there beside her in the dim light and I wanted to scream, not at her, at myself. Because I realized I had wasted the years when she would have understood. I wasted the years when she could have heard me. I wasted the years when I could have said, "I love you," and had her smile back and say, "I know." Now, even if I said it, I didn't know if it would reach her. And that's when I started saying it anyway. Every morning, every night, I would say, "I love you, Alina." Sometimes she would stare at me. Sometimes she would nod. Sometimes she would say, "Thank you," like I was a neighbor doing her a favor. And I would sit in the bathroom afterward and cry so quietly I could barely hear myself, because I didn't want her to see. Even then, I didn't want her to see. That's the kind of man I was, and I hated myself for it. But it was too late to change who I had been for 70 years. You can learn new habits, but you can't undo a lifetime of silence. In her last year, she stopped speaking much at all. She would sit in her chair by the window, looking out at the yard. The same yard she once filled with flowers. She would stare at the bird feeder and blink slowly like she was somewhere else. I would sit beside her and talk anyway. I would tell her stories from when we were young. I would tell her about the bookstore where we met. I would tell her about the first apartment we rented, with the leaky ceiling and the neighbor who played loud music. I would tell her about the night Susan was born and how Alina squeezed my hand so hard I thought she'd break it. Sometimes she would smile faintly like a flicker of recognition, and I would cling to those moments like they were oxygen. One afternoon I was talking and she turned her head toward me. Her eyes were clearer than they'd been in months. She looked at me and said very softly, "You were always so quiet." That's all she said, and then she turned back toward the window. I don't know if she meant it as an accusation or just an observation, but it landed in me like a stone, because it was the truest thing anyone ever said about me, and it was the last real thing she ever said to me. She died on a Tuesday morning in October. It was raining. I remember the sound of it against the window, gentle, steady rain, like the world was trying to be respectful. I was sitting beside her bed. I had been dozing in the chair, my neck stiff, my hands folded like I was praying even though I was. I woke up because the room felt different, too quiet. I looked at her and her mouth was slightly open. Her eyes were closed. Her face looked peaceful but also far away. I stood up and leaned close and said her name. Elena. No response. I touched her cheek and it was cool, and that was it, just like that. A whole life together and then a quiet room. I remember calling the nurse, my voice shaking. I remember signing papers. I remember the sound of my own breathing, loud and uneven. But what I remember most is what I said after they took her away. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty spot where her body had been, and I whispered, "I'm sorry." I said it over and over. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." But there was no one left to hear it. That's what regret really is. It's not guilt. It's not sadness. It's not even grief. It's the unbearable knowledge that the person who needed your words is gone, and your words are still inside you. I'm still here. That's the part people don't understand when they talk about death. They talk about the person who's gone, and yes, that matters. But they don't talk much about the person who stays behind in the quiet. After Alina died, the house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a museum of my own life. Every object had a memory attached to it, and none of those memories could speak back to me. Her shoes were still by the door for a while. I didn't move them. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I left them there, she might come back and slip her feet into them like she always did. I kept her coat hanging in the closet for 2 years. 2 years. That's not love. That's denial. Or maybe it's fear. Fear of finally accepting what's permanent. When you lose someone after 50 years, you don't just lose a person. You lose your routine, you lose your witness. You lose the one person who knew all your versions, and I realized something awful. I had spent so many years being the strong one that I didn't know how to be anything else. People came to the funeral. They said the usual things. They hugged me, patted my back, told me she was in a better place. I nodded. I thanked them. I kept my face steady. I was good at that. I had spent my entire life being good at that. After everyone left, I walked into the kitchen and sat at the table. I stared at the chair where Alina used to sit. It was empty, but I could still picture her there, her hands folded, her hair pinned back, her eyes tired. I opened my mouth like I was going to speak, and then I realized there was no one to speak to. I had built a whole life around keeping things inside, and now I was surrounded by the consequences of that. I thought about calling my children. David lived 3 states away. Susan lived closer, about 40 minutes. They had their own lives, their own families, their own problems. I didn't want to bother them. That's what I told myself. But the truth was I didn't know how to reach for them, not emotionally, not the way a father should. I had always been there in practical ways. I could fix a broken faucet. I could help with a car. I could lend money if they needed it. But calling my son just to say, "I miss you," that felt like stepping into a language I never learned. And when you're old, pride becomes a quiet prison, so I didn't call as much as I should have. Susan came over a lot in the first few months. She brought casseroles, cleaned the bathroom, made sure I was eating. She sat with me in the living room and tried to talk. Sometimes she'd ask about Alina. Sometimes she'd ask about how I was holding up. I'd tell her I was fine. Of course I did. She'd look at me the way Alina used to, like she was trying to see past my words. One day she said, "Dad, you don't have to act like you're okay." I remember my throat tightening. I stared at the television even though it wasn't on, and I said, "It's all right, I'm managing." She didn't argue, she just nodded, but I could see disappointment in her face, not anger, just sadness. Like she wanted something from me I couldn't give, and the moment passed like so many moments passed in my life. Quietly, I've had a lot of time to think since Alina died. Too much time, honestly. That's another thing people don't tell you about old age. When you're young, you complain about being busy. When you're old, you would give anything to be busy again. Because when there's nothing to do, you start hearing yourself. You start hearing all the things you avoided. You start hearing all the truth you buried under work and responsibility and routine. I started thinking back to the beginning, to the years when everything was still alive and full of possibility. I remembered Alina standing in that bookstore, brushing dust off a shelf, looking at me with that smile. I remembered our first apartment. It smelled like old carpet and cheap coffee. We didn't have much money. We ate a lot of soup and sandwiches, but we laughed. God, we laughed. I remembered the way she used to dance around the kitchen when she cooked, humming to herself. And I remembered how I used to watch her and feel something deep in my chest, and still not say a word. I thought love was something you carried quietly. I thought it was enough to stay. I didn't understand that love needs air, it needs sound, it needs to be spoken or it starts to suffocate. There was a moment in my 40s that comes back to me now like a sharp pain. Alina had been quiet for days, not angry, just withdrawn. She moved around the house like she was somewhere else. I asked her what was wrong. She said, "I don't think you see me." I laughed a little, not because it was funny, but because I didn't know how else to respond. I said, "Of course I see you." And she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "No, you don't. You live beside me, but you don't let me in." I remember feeling defensive. I remember saying, "I'm working my tail off for this family." I remember listing all the things I did, like love was a checklist, and she didn't yell. She didn't scream, she just nodded slowly like she had heard that answer before. Then she said something I didn't understand at the time. She said, "One day you're going to be alone and you're going to wish you had talked to me." I should have taken her in my arms. I should have said, "I'm sorry, I don't know how." I should have admitted I was scared, but I didn't. I went outside and pretended to be busy with the yard. That's what I did when I felt cornered. I found a task, a physical task. Something with tools, something that didn't require words. I was good at that. I could mow the lawn in silence while my marriage slowly starved. And the terrible part is I didn't even realize it was starving. I thought we were fine. We weren't fighting. We weren't breaking things. We weren't threatening divorce. So I assumed we were strong. But there's a kind of loneliness that doesn't look like a crisis. It looks like two people doing dishes in silence. It looks like going to bed at the same time but not touching. It looks like a wife stopping halfway through a sentence because she knows her husband isn't really listening. It looks like years passing without any real conversation. And then one day you wake up and the person you love is old and the distance between you is no longer something you can cross. Not because you don't want to, because you don't know how. After Alina died, I found an old box in the back of the closet. It was full of letters. Some were from her mother, some were from friends. And there was one envelope with my name on it. My full name written in Alina's handwriting. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. My hands shook opening it. Inside was a letter she had written years ago. I could tell because the paper was yellowed and the ink had faded a little. It wasn't dated, but I knew. It said things she never said out loud. She wrote about how much she loved me, how proud she was of our children, how grateful she was for the life we built. And then she wrote something that made me put the paper down and cover my face with my hands. She wrote, "Sometimes I feel like I'm married to a man who lives behind a closed door." That sentence, it broke something in me because she was right. I had lived behind a closed door my whole life, even with the people who loved me most. She wrote, "I don't need grand gestures. I just want to feel like you're with me. I want to hear you. I want to know what's inside you before it's too late." I read that line over and over, before it's too late. And it was too late. She had written that letter while she was still healthy, while she was still Alina, while she still had time to hear me, and I never saw it. Or maybe she never gave it to me. Maybe she kept it because she was still hoping I'd change without needing a letter. That's the kind of woman she was, always hoping, always patient. And I repaid her patience with silence. I cried harder that day than I cried at her funeral. Because funerals are full of people. There's noise, there's structure. You can hide inside the event, but reading that letter alone at my kitchen table, there was nowhere to hide. I started thinking about all the times I had wanted to speak and didn't. There were so many. I wanted to tell my father I was proud of him before he died. I never did. I shook his hand at the hospital and told him to rest. He died 2 days later. I wanted to tell my mother I appreciated her sacrifices. I never did. I visited, brought groceries, fixed things around her house, but I never sat down and said, "You mattered to me." She died thinking her love was simply expected. I wanted to tell my brother I missed him after we drifted apart. I never did. I assumed there would be a holiday or a family gathering where we'd reconnect naturally. Then he had a stroke at 61. He couldn't speak afterward. We never had that conversation. I wanted to tell Alina that I was afraid of losing her long before I ever did. I wanted to tell her she was the only place I ever felt truly safe. But I didn't. I waited, and waiting became my life. That's what I mean when I say I waited too long to say what I felt. It wasn't one big moment. It was 1,000 small moments, 1,000 chances, 1,000 little doors opening and me walking past them because I was too uncomfortable to step through. Now I sit in this quiet house and I understand something I didn't understand when I was younger. You don't get unlimited chances to be known. You don't get unlimited chances to tell people they matter. You don't get unlimited chances to soften, to apologize, to confess, to admit love. People get tired of waiting, or they get sick, or they die, or life simply pulls them away. And then the words you kept inside become heavy, not poetic heavy, real heavy, like carrying stones in your chest. Sometimes I look at old photos, Alina holding the kids, Alina smiling at the beach, hair blowing in the wind, Alina standing in the garden with dirt on her knees, and I think about what I should have said in those moments, not fancy words, just simple ones. I love you. I see you. Thank you. I'm sorry. I need you. Those are the words that matter, but those were the words I avoided most because they make you vulnerable, and I spent my life treating vulnerability like weakness. Now I know it was the opposite. It was courage. It takes courage to tell someone you love them and risk them not saying it back. It takes courage to apologize without defending yourself. It takes courage to say, I miss you, when you've been distant for years. It takes courage to let someone see you. And I didn't have that courage when it counted, so I'm speaking now to whoever is listening. Maybe you're young, maybe you're middle-aged. Maybe you're older than I am and you understand exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm not a teacher. I'm just a tired old man who finally understands what he lost. But I will tell you what I wish someone had told me. The words you are saving don't get more valuable with age. They don't ripen like fruit. They rot inside you if you keep them too long. And the people you love don't stay in the same place forever, waiting patiently for you to finally speak. They move through time just like you do. They change, they get older, they get tired, they leave. And if you wait until the funeral, you will be speaking to the air. I've done that. I've stood beside a grave and whispered things I should have said decades earlier. It doesn't help. It doesn't reach them. It only makes you realize how cruel time can be. There's a kind of loneliness that comes from losing someone, and then there's another kind. The loneliness of knowing you had them and you didn't give them what they needed while they were still here. That loneliness is quieter, but it cuts deeper, because it's your own fault. I talk to Alina sometimes, not out loud often, mostly in my head. When I'm washing dishes, I'll think, you would have laughed at this. When I'm folding laundry, I'll think, you always did this better than me. When I'm sitting on the porch in the evening, I'll think, you would have liked this sunset. And sometimes I'll say, softly, I'm sorry, Ellie. And I imagine her shaking her head the way she used to when I was being stubborn. But imagination is a poor substitute for a real conversation. If you still have someone in your life who matters to you, someone you think about when you're alone, someone whose absence would leave a hole in your days, don't wait until you're my age. Don't wait until you're sitting in a quiet kitchen with nothing but a letter and regret. You don't have to give speeches. You don't have to become someone you're not, but you can say one honest sentence, just one. You can call someone and tell them you were thinking about them. You can sit down with your spouse and say, I don't always know how to talk, but I love you. You can tell your children you're proud of them. You can tell your parents you forgive them or that you understand them better now. You can tell your friend you miss them. You can stop treating love like it's embarrassing, because love is not embarrassing. What's embarrassing is being 82 years old and realizing you spent your whole life acting like you had all the time in the world. I don't know how much time I have left. None of us do, really, but at my age, you feel it in your bones. You feel it when you stand up too fast. You feel it when you forget why you walked into a room. You feel it when you hear about another friend who passed in their sleep. I don't fear death the way I used to. What I fear is dying with more unsaid words still trapped inside me. I've started trying to do better even now. I call David more, not as often as I should, but more. Sometimes the calls are awkward. We talk about weather and sports and his job, the same safe topics, but once in a while before we hang up, I force myself to say something real. I'm glad you called. I miss you. I think about you a lot. There's usually a pause on the line, and then he says quietly, I miss you too, Dad. And that pause tells me everything. It tells me he's been waiting too. Susan hugs me tighter these days. She doesn't ask as many questions anymore. I think she's learned that I won't always answer. But sometimes when she's about to leave, I take her hand and say, thank you for coming. And she looks at me with surprise, like she's hearing a different man than the one she grew up with. Maybe she is. Maybe it's too late to become who I should have been, but it's not too late to stop pretending. And if this story meant something to you, if it made you think of someone you haven't spoken to in a while, you can leave a comment if you want. Not for me, for yourself. Just to put the truth somewhere outside your own chest, because I've learned something the hard way. Silence doesn't protect you, it doesn't keep you safe. It just keeps you alone, and I've had enough of being alone. I'm 82 years old now. Most of my life is behind me, and if I could go back, I wouldn't chase more success. I wouldn't buy a bigger house. I wouldn't work more hours. I would sit at that kitchen table with Alina across from me, flour on her cheek, laughing with the kids, and I would tell her the truth. I would tell her she was my whole life. I would tell her I saw her. I would tell her I was scared, but I loved her anyway. I would tell her the words I thought I had time to say later, because later is a lie we tell ourselves when we're afraid, and eventually later becomes never. That's what happened to me. And that's what I'm trying to confess now before my own voice disappears. Not to be remembered, not to be forgiven, just to finally tell the truth. I waited too long to say what I felt, and I don't want you to make the same mistake.